Hi, Stephen Hand from Staccato in Hobart. Over the last couple of months, I've done a few videos that have talked about sword length, and today I want to talk about the transition between swords and rapiers. Now, everyone acknowledges that there was a transition between these two weapons. If we look at these two weapons, we can see there's a difference in blade width, in blade length. We have a simple cross hilt on the sword and a quite complex hilt on the rapier. So clearly there has been a transition, but there's some debate about what the nature of that transition. The two basic ideas that are out there is firstly that there's an idea that there was a transitional weapon, right? And that transitional weapon is usually called a side sword. So something like this, where we've got a little bit more complex hilt than the medieval arming sword, not as complex as the rapier, and a blade which is slightly narrower and longer than the arming sword, but not as long and narrow as the rapier. The other idea is that there wasn't a transitional weapon as such, there was just a step-by-step transition from the sword to the rapier, and that each new master had a slightly different idea of what his sword would be. The term side sword, or spada d'arlato, is in itself a fairly controversial term. Most of the masters simply called their weapon a sword or spada in the Italian. Where the term spada d'arlato comes from is from Vigiani, and Vigiani, in his manual from 1575, and I'm going to consult my notes to get this exactly right, he talks about causa del portare la spada d'arlato stenco, which really just means the reason for carrying the sword on the left side. So it's not really not convincing to say that this should be translated as side sword. It's just saying the sword's carried on the left side. We also get the term spada di filo, which literally translates as edge sword, but really all that means is a sword with an edge, a sharp sword, as opposed to a blunt training sword. So again, that's not a very convincing term. The masters, as I've said, tended just to call them swords. So, how can we determine whether there was three distinct populations of weapons, or whether there was two distinct populations of weapons, swords, rapiers, and then a transition between the two? We could go away and we could measure hundreds of weapons from dozens of different museums, but an easier way to look at the transition between swords and rapiers is to actually look at the fencing manuals. If we look at the fencing manuals and we look at the weapons, if we compare the lengths of the weapons, now we can't really do much in terms of weight. If we look at the weights, bizarrely people tend to think of, people are still calling rapiers light weapons. If we actually look at these three weapons, this has an 82 centimetre blade, or 32.5 inches, and it weighs, if I check, 2.5 pounds or 1.1 kilograms. The 16th century sword has a 97 centimetre blade, which is about 39 inches, and it weighs 1.2 kilos, or about 2.7 pounds. The rapier weighs 1.3 kilos. And I don't know about this is a Del Tin. I don't know how accurate the Del Tin is, but both the arming sword and the rapier are based on surviving originals. This is from an original from 1615 that's in the Royal Armouries, and This replica is the exact weight, the exact length of the original as the arming sword is of the original that it was based on. The original of this has a 42.5 inch blade, or about 107 centimetres, and the weight is 1.3 kilos or 2.9 pounds. So the rapier is heavier than the arming sword, heavier than the 16th century sword. So going back to how can we use the manuals to work out how long our swords were. What I've done in the illustration that I'm about to show you is that I have compared the length of the sword to the height of the human figures using them, the height of the fencers using them in the manual. So in each of the swords here is drawn to scale with the human figure. As we can see, looking at the far left of the illustration, the swords, the first sword is from manuscript 133 from about 1300, and the second one is taken from Talhofer, his manual from 1467. And both of those are consistently 55% of the height of the wielder. If we then go to the other end of the right-hand end of the illustration, we see that the rapiers start at 78% of the height of the wielder and go up to a fairly ridiculous 89% with Joseph Sweetenham's. Now, Joseph Sweetenham is a bit of an outlier, but he actually admits that his illustrations are inaccurate, and if you actually care to look at his quarterstaff illustration, as Paul Wagner so nicely pointed out in an article, it actually breaks the laws of physics. So I wouldn't put too much on Sweetenham's illustrations. All the rest of them are fairly consistent. And as we can see, the populations of sword and rapier show a straight line, a fairly uniform weapon. If we look at the central population, the 16th century swords, we can see that there is a steady rise in length over the century, which would tend to suggest that there was a slow, gradual transition rather than there being a distinct transitional weapon. However, what we also see is that there is a gap. There's a very distinct gap between swords down at the left. The first side sword, the first 16th century sword, is 63% of the height of the wielder, which is a full 8% more than the arming swords. And similarly, we get a significant step up to the rapiers at the other end. So it does seem like there is a distinct population, even though within that population, the difference between the two ends is greater than the difference between that end and either swords at the one end or rapiers at the other. But there does seem to be a transitional weapon with a smooth transition within that. So basically the conclusion from looking at this data is that neither of the two hypotheses, one that there was a distinct transitional weapon, the other that there was simply a smooth transition from swords up to rapiers, neither of those hypotheses is really borne out completely by the data, but neither of them is disproved by it either. What we seem to have is a distinct population of swords, a distinct population of rapiers, and in the middle, separated from both the rapiers and the swords, a distinct population of 16th century swords, but within that population, very big changes over the centuries as the swords got larger and indeed the hilt furniture got more elaborate. So, neither of the prevailing hypotheses fully explains what the data tells us. So, was there a transitional weapon? Yes and no. Thanks for watching.